Before I introduce today's guest, our podcast is brought to you by the Skeptic Society. So be sure and make a donation if you can. That's tax deductible at skeptic.com/donate. We appreciate all your support for all of our projects, including the magazine and all our media appearances and the podcast. So we really appreciate that. Our specific advertiser sponsor is the Great Courses Plus. It's an app on your phone. You just touch the app like that, and it opens right up to different courses. Today's course I'm going to talk to you about is The Black Death, appropriate for my guest's new book, which I'll introduce in just a moment. This is a 24-lecture course on the Black Death taught by Dorsey Armstrong, and it covers 30-minute lectures, 24 of these 30-minute lectures. So the way it works, through the app, you access all of the courses that the Great Courses produces, and any of the lectures that you want. So you can listen to them in order or skip around. You can skip courses if you want. And the deal is if you go to their webpage and through my podcast, you get a free trial and 20% off. That comes off to about $30 off per year. So it's a good deal. So it's a subscription model to get you access to all these different courses. You go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer to get your free trial and the 20% discount off the subscription. Again, the way it works, you just open it up and you just start listening to a lecture. For example, the first one is on Europe and the brink of the Black Death, the epidemiological aspects of the plague, the Black Death in Florence, in France, in Avignon, in England, in Walsham, and so on and so forth, all the way down to communities that survived, the Black Death's political outcomes, and how the Black Death transformed the world, lecture number 24. I've already taken this course, so I can highly recommend it. I usually listen to it at 1.2 speed, so you can get a 30-minute lecture done in 20 minutes, which is nice for quick workouts and commutes and whatnot. So that's the deal. Thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer gets you that free trial and the discount. Now, this is appropriate for my guest today is Niall Ferguson. His new book is Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe. Niall is the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and a Senior Faculty Fellow at the Balfour Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard. He is also a visiting professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing and the author of 15 books, including The Pity of War, The House of Rothschild, Empire, Civilization, and Kissinger, 1923 to 1968, The Idealist. He's now working on part 2 of his biography of Kissinger. His previous book was The Square and the Tower, published in the United States in 2018. Here's that book, which I also read. It's quite good. It's about network theory and applied to history, which is really fabulous. Anyway, the new book is obviously about COVID-19, the pandemic, and all of that, but we also put that into context. He does in our conversation. We review all that of how he compares this year with the tumultuous years of 1968 to 1972 with Vietnam and Watergate and all that, and then going back to the pandemic in the 1950s, and then to the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, and then all the way back to the Black Death and Roman Empire plagues and so forth, and how these sorts of events affect history in very, very unpredictable ways. So we also talk about the contingent nature of history, the hindsight bias. You can always figure out the causal chain after the fact, but not before. We talk about the difference between doomsday and disaster, and the difference between catastrophes and the general background noise of just bad things that happen, and Cassandras and Pollyannas, and why we need both. But the problem is the Cassandras are always predicting bad things. The line is for economics, predicting 9 of the last 5 recessions, or in the case of doomsdayers, predicting 0 of the last, predicting 900 of the last 0 actual doomsday scenarios. We talk about natural versus man-made disasters and to what extent they're all political and economic, depending on how you respond to them. We talk about social networks and disasters. We talk about the Titanic, the Challenger, and Chernobyl, and what those kind of disasters can teach us about how to prepare for future disasters or prevent them. the availability heuristic, negativity bias, and how that interrupts or makes it difficult to make predictions. And then we kind of go to the lightning round. And we talk about counterfactual history and the nature of conservatism and the Republican Party post-Trump. We talk about cryptocurrency and the nature of money. To what extent is this inevitable? Is it going to happen? And then the killer apps that he outlines in his book Civilization. The 6 killer apps are competition, scientific method, the rule of law, modern medicine, consumerism, and the work ethic. And now, all these years later, after post-COVID, when that comes, do we need some more killer apps? What is it about Western civilization that's different from other civilizations, and in the context of what we've all just gone through? So with that, please enjoy this conversation. Now let's talk about the kind of random distribution of pandemics and what we can learn from history, going back to the Spanish flu. Or you have a discussion of the 1950s pandemic, but also the Spanish flu in 1918, since we're a century away from that, and then all the way back to the Roman Empire, which is one reason I like your work, because you have such a big perspective on these things.
Well, one of the things that's very striking if you study pandemics throughout recorded history is that they really are close to a parallel distribution. There are a couple of absolutely cataclysmic pandemics, of which the Black Death is the best known and the one about which we can be most confident. So in the 1340s, there's a devastating outbreak of bubonic plague, which sweeps Europe and kills up to 30 or 40% of the population. It's almost unimaginably horrific if one tries to work out what proportion of humanity is killed, because it also clearly occurred in Eurasia generally. You end up with something up to a third of the human race. It's possible that one of the great Roman plagues, the plague of Justinian, was equally bad, but we don't have such good data. And there's some archaeological reason to be skeptical that it was as bad. So that's the worst of them all. The most terrible pandemic of recent times, as you mentioned, was the 1918 to 19 Spanish influenza, which had nothing to do with Spain. It just got reported in the Spanish press because during wartime, neutral Spain didn't have much press censorship, but you couldn't really read about how bad it was in most European and indeed in much North American press. So the Spanish flu was an absolute cataclysm, probably 40 times worse than COVID in terms of its impact on the global population. And this was a new strain of influenza that seems to have originated in American military bases in 1918 and then spread very rapidly, partly because of troop movements, but clearly it transmitted to every part of the world in the course of the period of roughly 2 years, reaching everywhere, all the places, including places that had nothing to do with World War I. And that's a helpful episode to study because one gets a sense of what a really bad pandemic looks like. If there had been something that bad, we would have seen something closer to 2 million American deaths. And of course, at this point, we're looking at somewhat higher than 500,000. So I think the Spanish influenza, which was mentioned a lot last year, including by epidemiologists like my near namesake, Niall Ferguson at Imperial College London, wasn't really the best point of comparison because it was clearly a much more lethal virus, killed many young people. And this is a point that we can't emphasize too much. COVID kills the elderly disproportionately, unlike most pandemics, which tend to kill the very young and the very old, and some pandemics like the Spanish flu, which actually take people out in the prime of life, which means that if you calculate the number of life years lost, it's even higher than the numbers I've given you would suggest, because you're losing a lot of life years when young people die. I think our experience is closer, though it's not exactly the same, but closer to the 1957-58 Asian flu, an episode which is much less well remembered. Even although it looks like you do rough math, it killed about the same proportion of the world's population as COVID has so far. I think COVID will be worse in the end because clearly it's not over. And what's going on in countries like India suggests that we're going to see a significant number of deaths between now and the end of the pandemic. But it's still going to be closer to 57, 58 than to 1918, 19. And we should therefore probably have spent a bit more time thinking about that pandemic, the 1950s experience, than about the one that followed the end of World War One.
Yeah, I remember when that Niall Ferguson report came out, I thought, oh, that's what he's doing now. Wrong guy. What went wrong with those predictive models?
Luckily my parents gave my name a different spelling. Otherwise, I'd have got a lot more hate mail than usual.
Right. You've been double canceled. But what went wrong with those models? And, since we were talking before our interruption of counterfactual history, if you change things, you'd see how it plays out. Should we have shut down earlier, shut down later, maybe masked earlier, but socially isolated differently? What's your sense about that?
I think there was a kind of false dichotomy in much of the public discussion in the US last year, in which we had a sort of stark choice between total lockdown and letting the virus rip. And I think that was never really the policy choice that we faced. The correct option was clearly the one that they adopted in Taiwan and South Korea, which was rapidly to ramp up testing, to roll out a system of contact tracing, and then to quarantine people who were infected or likely to be infected. And we could have done that. It's not like we lacked the technology, but we elected not to. We essentially dithered around through January, February, and into mid-March. And then the public health experts, because I do think the responsibility lay there as much as with presidents and prime ministers, I think slightly panicked, partly because they saw the other Niall Ferguson's mid-March projections that 2.2 million Americans could die and 500,000 Brits if you didn't lock down, and thought, well, in that case, we'd better lock down. But the lockdowns were a very blunt instrument that had to be used after we had mistakenly let the virus spread unchecked. So the real counterfactual is, why weren't we Taiwan or South Korea? Taiwan, much, much closer geographically to the People's Republic of China. 11 people have been recorded as having died from COVID, and they didn't have to do lockdowns. So we did end up with a suboptimal policy mix. I think the other point that's worth making is that if you had not done lockdowns, in other words, if you hadn't had strict rules preventing people leaving their homes and going to work, which were introduced in many states in around March, it's not like people would just have carried on regardless. We know from some good research by Austin Goolsbee and others that there was quite a significant adaptation of behavior before orders were imposed. People basically dialed back their mobility quite early on, realizing that this was probably not the time to go to the stores or to go to bars and restaurants. So I think we must allow for the fact that absent lockdowns, people would have adapted their behavior, and therefore the counterfactual of the Niall Ferguson paper that we just have carried on and had 2.2 million dead, that never seemed to me plausible. Plus, I think he almost certainly added a variable of the infection fatality rate of 0.9% that was on the high side. I mean, in the end, the thing about COVID that makes it different from influenza is partly this strange low dispersion factor, where about 20% infected people do 80% of the spreading. And super spreaders are really more important than in an influenza pandemic. Now, if you have that, lockdowns are a very blunt instrument because you're essentially imposing restrictions on everybody, when in practice, it's a minority of people who do most of the spreading, and it's also a minority of people who are really vulnerable, namely the elderly and people with comorbidities. So I think we'll look back and say the lockdowns were a blunt instrument that we resorted to because we'd missed the opportunity to do this right, and the unintended economic and other consequences of the lockdowns were probably much bigger than a really good cost-benefit analysis would have thought made it worthwhile. I think we underestimated those costs, and we'll finally see that the benefits of lockdowns were probably outweighed slightly by the costs. We don't know yet. It's a bit too early to draw that conclusion, but that's kind of my hunch at this point.
I had Michelle Gelfand on the podcast just before the pandemic. Her book came out just before that on tight versus loose cultures, and she's since published a paper on this showing predictably that tighter cultures, say like Germany or Japan, maybe New Zealand, versus looser cultures like Italy and the United States, that is to say, to what extent people are willing to go along with what authorities tell them to do. And the United States is famously, individualistic, and I'll do whatever I damn well please, and keep your government hands out of my private life, and so forth. And you hear that a lot, in response to, Dr. Fauci's, admonitions to do this or that. It's like, what does he know? And so on. And so I think some of that may factor into it as well. Although, to be fair, there's so much unpredictability, and even everything we learned from this pandemic that you just outlined, it may not apply to the next one. Maybe it's younger people that die and older people that are spared. Maybe the super spreaders are not the factor. Maybe everybody's equally spreading, or maybe people die faster so it doesn't spread as fast. There's just like 20 variables that could play into the next one that we cannot learn from this.
Exactly. And I think that there's a couple of points that I'd make in response. One is that when you look at the US response, the public's tendency is to treat everything as political, which it wasn't inclined to do in the 1950s. Every single thing from mask wearing to vaccination became politicized in this pandemic. And that seems to me maybe more significant than notions of cultural tightness of the sort that Michel talks about, which I cite in the book, but I don't think explain everything. What's really striking about the US compared with the US a couple of generations back is this tendency for everything to be politicized. Yeah, some Americans in red states were very defiant of public health advice, but that wasn't true of people on the coasts. In fact, I see continued observance, pointless observance actually, of mask wearing in parts of California and New England. I mean, there are even parts of Massachusetts where they're saying, no, you have to keep wearing a mask outside even when you've been vaccinated. That's Brookline, Massachusetts. That's crazy. But it suggests that in some parts of America, in liberal America, let's call it blue America, there was almost an overcompliance because it became a kind of badge of one's liberalism to be wearing a mask even when walking through a public park, if indeed the parks were even open. So I think that's an important feature of what we've seen in the US. And it's a problem because if everything gets politicized, you end up with absurd outcomes, such as the Americans who probably most need to get vaccinated being the ones who are least ready to do it, which means we'll probably get a fourth wave at some point in the fall, when a lot of people in the American South, for example, who've held out against getting vaccinated, even though they're quite elderly, because they're conservatives, are going to fall ill and maybe die. So I do think we have a problem in the sense that public health issues that didn't used to be politicized, that weren't politicized in the 1950s, now are.
Yeah, masks are a proxy for something else, either a social signal that I trust authorities or I trust the science, even wearing that little bumper sticker, follow the science or believe the science, or not, or I don't trust authorities, that and the mask stands for some kind of suppression of my liberty. A little bit like when I was debating John Lott on guns. John wrote that book, More Guns, Less Crime. And anyway, I did a series of debates with him. I'm pretty classically liberal, so sort of libertarian type guy. But I thought, the gun thing, this is really getting out of hand. 35,000 people a year dead. Maybe we need some gun controls. But in most of the public debates, the sense I got was it wasn't really about guns. The guns stood for something else. Freedom, autonomy, liberty. I'm against tyranny. I don't like big government, and it wouldn't have mattered if it's 350,000 people that die by guns. That was not the issue. And I thought, okay, so these things tend to stand for something else, and I have a feeling that's what the mask, social distancing is. We're seeing that as well.
One of the stranger features of 2020 was the surge in gun purchases
yes, right.
That we saw, particularly of handguns. There was massive gun buying last year, which I remember feeling quite worried about, particularly when there was a great deal of unrest following the death of George Floyd. But in fact, it didn't really go anywhere because the truth, most people who buy guns never do anything with them. They are symbolic. And I plead guilty to this. I was encouraged to invest in a firearm. and it gathers dust after one
Right.
somewhat unsatisfactory practice session. So I think this gets to the heart of our strange psychology as a species and why we struggle a bit with the notion of disaster. We kind of think rather excitedly that there's going to be a complete collapse of civic order, and we're going to be in some kind of science fiction type post-apocalypse scenario. We've seen that in the movies often enough to know what that looks like. But the probability of that happening is way, way lower than we seem to think, and perhaps in our hearts of hearts we know it won't really happen, and so we sort of buy the gun, but we don't really practice that much with it, and most people, I suspect, never come anywhere close to firing a shot in anger.
Now, you talked about, well, your book is titled Doom, but in fact, you're kind of hinting at the psychology behind it, that most people, when they encounter an incident like this, take Chernobyl, since you talked about that. I remember when Chernobyl happened, a lot of my scientist friends were, that's it, it's over. I mean, the whole world's going to fall apart, and whatever, just pick your example there. So you make the distinction between doomsday and disaster. Disasters happen. Plagues and wars are the two big ones you identify. But this doesn't mean an existential doomsday. I'm often amused by this idea of terrorism as an existential threat. But I've never heard a good argument for how it could be. I mean, even if somehow Al-Qaeda or ISIS or somebody got hold of a dirty nuke and detonated it in New York Harbor and 1 million people died, well, what's going to happen? The president's going to hand the keys over to the White House to the terrorists? I mean, nothing like this is going to happen. I mean, the only scenario maybe would be a total thermonuclear exchange of a fairly high order. That could extinguish every last human. Maybe. Or even something like a Black Death. But even that played itself out. And, there was quite a few positive changes after that. So we recover. And, there's people that study disasters show that even after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I mean, the Japanese were like opening the banks the next week and, cleaning up the streets and getting back to business fairly quickly.
I was startled when I delved into Chernobyl, one of the many famous disasters that I write about in the book, by the low death toll. I had certainly assumed many more people had died. And in fact, the numbers are really surprisingly small, including of people who were in close proximity to the explosion of the reactor. There was certainly all kinds of radioactive material blown across Europe, but the deaths associated with that pollution are extremely few and far between. And I think this illustrates a really important point. You mentioned Steve Pinker earlier, and I think it's worth acknowledging a point that he's made repeatedly. We have a media ecosystem designed to exaggerate the scale and likelihood of doom because it sells. If it bleeds, it leads. And this leads, I think, to a tendency for each disaster to seem A, unprecedented, and B, potentially apocalyptic. And I think in reality, what doom shows is that much as we're fascinated by the end of days, and every major religion has some kind of apocalypse as part of its offering, in truth, it doesn't happen, and it's pretty unlikely to happen anytime soon. This, of course, leads to the vexed question of climate change. But when people predict the end of the world in 12 years, which must be 10 years now, because I think that prediction was made 2 years ago, they're doing something we've been doing really since the beginning of recorded history, which is exaggerating the probability of the end of the world, because we're slightly fascinated by that. The more you fixate on these apocalyptic scenarios, I think the less well equipped you are for the real disasters that come along, that are mostly localized, that come in all kinds of different forms, and only rarely become global. And to become global, you need to have some network effect of the sort that a plague has, or a war with a radical ideology driving it has. There are really interesting examples, which I enjoyed studying in the book, of global disasters caused by geological activity. And one of the things I came away struck by was the fact that we've had a really quiet few centuries in terms of volcanic activity. But if you go back to the 1100s and 1200s, or even right up until Tambora's eruption in 1815, world's climate has been subject to periods of significant cooling because of massive volcanic eruptions. We just haven't had anything that big since around 1815. And you have to ask yourself how quickly the conversation would change if we reverted to those past levels of geological instability. We'd be talking about global cooling in the space of a very short time if, let's say, the Yellowstone supervolcano went off. So this seems to me the point of a book like Doom. It's about trying to get our orders of magnitude right and recognize that you can't really attach probabilities to these things, but they're there, and that there's a possibility that something like this could happen and render all our discussions of climate change obsolete in an afternoon.
Well, there are proposals for geoengineering and like putting particles up in the atmosphere to block the sun, just like volcanoes do, and have that effect. What could possibly go wrong? Tinkering with
right.
complex systems like that.
The joke would be on us if nature went ahead and did that geoengineering for us.
Right. Yeah, so also the negativity bias, we notice, in addition to the media ecosystem, we notice negative things more than positive things. Losses hurt twice as much as gains feel good, loss aversion. We have more words for negative emotions than positive emotions. And, so, we're kind of designed because of entropy to notice the things that go wrong, because there's way more ways for things to go wrong than to go right. I think Pinker makes the analogy of a sandcastle. There's only so many ways you can take particles of sand with water and mix them up and structure them into some way. But there's a million ways for wind and waves and little children to knock it back into a blob of amorphous sand. And that's kind of a metaphor for the human body. The best thing is for to have no pain, just have nothing going on, just blissful nothingness is perfect because there's nothing going wrong. Usually there's just something going wrong all the time. And so our systems are a little bit like that. So to get to my favorite chapter in your book on, the Hindenburg, the Titanic, the Challenger, and Chernobyl. What's the take home from those? To just kind of review those because they're such interesting examples of disasters.
Well, we've heard of them, and they loom large in our collective memories, not because vast numbers of people died. In the case of the Space Shuttle Challenger, it was a tiny number of people, but because they were spectacular disasters and exposed perhaps some of the hubris of our technological ambition. Titanic was seen as one of the great feats of nautical engineering of its day, just as the Space Shuttle Challenger was a symbol of American technological prowess. So when something like that sinks or blows up, it's a great story, so we all hear about it. But I think the key thing is that we tend to form an erroneous conclusion of what caused it. And this becomes embedded in popular culture. The Titanic became a metaphor for an unequal class society. The villains were the people traveling in first class. For many years after the disaster, the proprietor of the White Star Line was held personally responsible for the calamity. It turns out that actually none of the accepted stories about Titanic, the popularly accepted stories, make sense. And I was fascinated to discover that even the quite well-known notion that there weren't enough lifeboats there to save money to make room for the first-class passengers to have their promenades, even that falls apart because contemporary experienced naval officer argued not long after the disaster that having more lifeboats really wouldn't have saved many lives because of the extreme difficulty of getting lifeboats safely into the water with passengers on board unless you have a lot of very highly trained crews. So as I began to unpack each of these disasters, I was struck by a very important common feature. And that is that although blame often gets attached to the person at the top of an organization, the buck obviously stops there, really the failure tended to be somewhere further down the chain of command. And I owe the great physicist Richard Feynman this insight because it was his account of the inquest into the Challenger disaster that for me was a eureka moment. Now, for those who haven't read Feynman's brilliant account of what happened, spoiler alert, what Feynman discovered was that, in fact, the engineers at NASA knew there was a 1 in 100 probability that the space shuttle would blow up because of leaking fuel in the launching jets, because of a defective piece of equipment, the O-rings. But when they explained this to the bureaucrats, the middle management folks at NASA, they turned that into 1 in 100,000 probability, because they really did not want to tell the people writing the checks, i.e. the US Congress, that there was such a high risk to the space shuttle program, for fear that the whole thing got shut down. So I suddenly realized that a lot of disasters have this feature, that there's somebody somewhere in middle management either fudging the expert advice or making a mistake in good faith. And I think that's an important insight into what I think of as the fractal geometry of disaster. We tend to want to pin the blame on the person at the top, but on closer inspection, the operational failure is usually due to some other form of rather prosaic mistake made by middle management. So it's not the people at the top, nor is it necessarily the people at the sharp end. I mean, you can't blame the Titanic on the people who were actually in command of the vessel at that moment, tempting though it is to do that, because there was a fundamental design flaw in the way that the Titanic's hull was built. And that design flaw only really revealed itself to the engineer himself when the boat began to list. I must say, writing that part of the book for me was hugely exciting, because it made me think that we have to change our way of framing disaster and recognize that in most complex undertakings, there's a sort of bureaucratic vulnerability that we tend to overlook, because we're always very eager to blame the man at the top. And that was, of course, very true last year, when it was just so tempting to say that it was all Donald Trump's fault. A lot of it perhaps was, but the counterfactual, to go back to our earlier discussion, that if there had been a different president, there wouldn't have been excess mortality in the United States, seems like a really implausible one to me.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right. And you also talked about the two 747s colliding at Tenerife. I think, what was that, 1987 or something like that. And it came down to whether the co-pilot kind of felt comfortable challenging his boss, the pilot, about some following the rules or not, something like that. You do wonder to what extent
this is one of
these are kind of overdetermined. Like the Titanic iceberg guys didn't have their binoculars that night, and had they had their binoculars, they would have seen it a half a mile earlier, and they could have turned, and then we wouldn't know about the engineering problem because they wouldn't have hit. How do you think about causality in that kind of chain of causal events?
Well, I think the key thing is not to overcomplicate the story. The 1977, it was 77 actually, disaster that happened at Tenerife when two 747s collided ultimately happened because of foggy conditions in a small airport that wasn't really capable of handling such big planes, and a catastrophic pilot error. There was a certain amount of the law of unintended consequences, maybe the only true law in history, in that one reason the Dutch pilot was in a hurry, too much of a hurry to make good judgments, was that new regulations had just been introduced limiting the amount of time that Dutch flight crew could actually be in the air. And he was worried that if they didn't get off the ground, they'd all be stuck for another 24 hours. But I found that as I started to unpick the disasters, Titanic being one, and this famous, not so famous, actually largely forgotten air disaster being another, I realized that one had to be prepared to allow for multiple variables. And the temptation is not only to blame the man at the top, but there's also a temptation to fixate on one particular sharp end error. You mentioned the case of the missing binoculars on the Titanic. This is similar to the for want of a nail theory of history. If it had only been for that one nail in a horseshoe, the outcome of the battle would have been different. And that, I think, is to trivialize the complexity of the historical process. I don't think a pair of binoculars would have prevented the Titanic from striking that iceberg, because it wasn't going very fast. And that's one of the things that often gets gets lost in accounts of the Titanic disaster. They weren't striving to break some record. On the contrary, the average speed was relatively low. The thing sank relatively slowly compared with other sinkings. One of the things I learned from reading up on the Titanic for Doom was it was one of the rare occasions in a nautical disaster when women and children really did leave the vessel first. That turns out not to happen usually, but it really did on the Titanic, which speaks well of the male passengers and crew. So I think what one comes away from these analyses realizing is that the simple narratives we want to attach to disasters and need to be viewed with some skepticism. Example, in the case of the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl, an entire drama series was built around the notion that this could only have happened in the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union had a distinct tendency for mendacity, lies, lies, lies. You may have watched the excellent dramatization.
I did.
But,
I
but
saw
the
it.
idea
Yeah.
that it could only have happened in the Soviet system just flies in the face of what we know about other nuclear near disasters, of which 3 Mile Island's the best known. I mean, that was a very close run thing, that wasn't a lot worse. And many of the things that went wrong at Chernobyl also went wrong at 3 Mile. So I've learned to be skeptical of the headline accounts of disaster, because often the reality is more banal. And until we recognize that, I think we're going to misunderstand why things have gone so wrong in the past year and a bit. If we conclude that this was all because we elected a populist president, and it wouldn't have happened if Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama had been president, we will miss the fact that something went really badly wrong at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and at the Department of Health and Human Services, that the people whose job it was to prepare for a pandemic failed. And all the preparedness that we thought we had, and we were supposed to be very well prepared according to some global rankings, turned out to be basically worthless. And we got to understand why that was, and not simply say because Donald Trump was an imbecile, because that's not the right answer, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I was at that TED conference when Bill Gates gave that speech. I think that was 2014 or 2015. Our next big disaster is coming, and it's going to be a pandemic. And I remember everybody thinking, yeah. But, we've heard this before, SARS and MERS, and it just never happened. So I'm just not going to worry about it. Well, then it does happen. But, there's reasons why it didn't happen before, and you talk about that, and how those pandemics were different, the viruses were different, and so on. So there's just so many variables to make prediction virtually impossible, particularly with complex systems. So let's just talk about that for a second. I mean, the space shuttle, it's amazing every other one doesn't blow up. So it was 2 out of 114 launches, I think, something like that. So, once every 50 or so, it's going to blow up. That's actually pretty good considering, there's 200 million parts on the thing or something. And so I was going to ask you later about artificial intelligence as a potential existential threat, which, there's a bunch of books about this and so on. But Kevin Kelly makes the point that complex systems like that have so many steps and so many people involved that it could not get to the point where it became existentially threatening without a lot of people noticing and a lot of steps along the way that could interrupt the chain of causes that get to the disaster. So how do you think about, I'm just curious, I was always curious what your thoughts are on AI anyway, but that in the context of a potential disaster.
Well, I think one has to steer clear of too science fiction a scenario that we arrive at artificial general intelligence and it quickly forms the view that we are the problem, and if we can only be eradicated, the problem of global warming will have been solved. I mean, that's clearly a great science fiction plot, but it's not a very likely reality. After all, it's proving to be very difficult indeed to get cars to drive themselves, and that's a relatively prosaic problem. The idea that we're going to build a doomsday machine that has the capacity to wipe us out if we can't get AI to get a car down a busy street seems a bit unlikely. I mean, I round up as best I can the various disaster threats we face. And the point of looking at everything from AI to genetic engineering to nanotechnology. The point of thinking about all those things going wrong is not to say that there's a high probability they will go wrong, but rather to show that we have a pretty wide range of different things that can go wrong. And some of them are quite old school. I mean, war is still, it seems to me, the prime contender for a lot of excess mortality in a really short time. US-China war would be pretty disastrous, even if it only lasted a short time. And then there are these novel threats, to say nothing of the ones we've just kind of stopped thinking about, like the big geological disasters. I'm not attaching high probabilities to any of these individually, but I think if you add them all together, you can see that the probability of some really large disaster comparable in magnitude to COVID-19 in, say, the next 20 years is not trivial. The trouble is we don't know which one it will be. And that means that we mustn't be meticulously well prepared for just one scenario to the exclusion of the others. What worries me a lot about our current climate of discussion of disaster is that it is excessively fixated on climate change. Notice Bill Gates now says that that's the thing we should worry about. And since he was one of the people who predicted a pandemic, we kind of are all going to listen to that even more closely. But climate change is a relatively slow-moving threat to humanity compared with some of the other things that could move a whole lot faster. And if we spend all of our time at grand conferences and on Zoom talking about the threat of climate change and don't think about any of the other scenarios, we'll deserve to be blindsided by an unexpected disaster. So it's, I think, better to kind of look at the broad range of things that can go wrong and then cultivate a greater flexibility and resilience than we currently have. If I compare the United States today with the United States in the 1950s, the federal government is both larger and much less nimble than it was. And its performance in handling crises seems to have got worse. I think that would be a view that others, Francis Fukuyama, for example, would share. And the reason it's got worse, I think, is that we have an exceptionally bureaucratic mentality, a formalism, and a tendency to assess risk as if we'd all been to law school. And that means that what happens is that in this abundance of caution, we create elaborate ex ante regulations for the contingency that we're very focused on. And that means you produce a lot of apparent preparedness, but you're actually not very flexible when the crisis comes. What I'm impressed by in, say, Taiwan is the way that the government has become far more generally responsive, rather than being excessively focused on a particular scenario, and has used technology in intelligent ways to try to empower citizens rather than simply building a surveillance superstate. AI is clearly being used right now by the Chinese government to build a totalitarian system far more intrusive and comprehensive than anything that George Orwell ever imagined. And in that sense, there already is an AI threat to humanity because we know that totalitarianism kills. The pretty much the most deadly thing that happened in the 20th century was that we built totalitarian regimes which killed tens of millions of people. So I think the big threat to my mind that AI poses is not a science fiction threat. It's a real existing threat that the Communist Party of China is now much more powerful than it used to be, thanks to these technologies.
Yeah, you make the point in your book that being too focused on an existential disaster that could lead to ultimate doom is a waste of time because that's not going to happen. And B, then you miss the real threats, which are these, like you just said, curtailments of freedoms and liberty and things like that. Or they only kill 10 million. Well, that's still a lot. Even though it's not doomsday, that's a lot, right? So we should care about that.
Exactly.
You talk about Cassandras and Pollyannas. I love that little, the bells of hell go ting-a-ling-a-ling for you, but not for me. There's no shortage of Cassandras. You use the line, economists predicting 9 of the last 5 recessions and doomsdayers predicting, 100 of the last 0, doomsday scenarios. But we should listen to Cassandras. The problem is there's an endless stream of them. Which one should we pay attention to? So here, I guess the question is, where do we put expertise? Which experts do we value and not? How do you think about that?
There's a nice book that Richard Clarke did with R.P. Eddy a few years ago, which looks at the Cassandra syndrome, showing that in the prelude to various disasters, including 9/11, but also Hurricane Katrina, there were people, Clarke was one of them, predicting the disaster. And they say, well, we need to have a kind of institutionalization of Cassandras. We need to have Cassandras in the government. And I don't agree with that. As you say, the problem is that if you got all the Cassandras predicting the end of the world together, you'd need a stadium to house them all, and a significant proportion of them would be batshit crazy. So I'm not convinced that we can institutionalize prophets. The point about Cassandra in her original incarnation in Greek drama was that nobody believed her. And Cassandra's are by and large not believed, and therefore giving them government jobs isn't, I think, going to solve the fundamental problem. The reason we don't believe Cassandra's is that we hear way more predictions of disaster than there are disasters, and we do have, I think, a not unreasonable psychology which says, you're telling me the world is going to end, but I got to live my life, as if that's not going to happen. Because throughout the Cold War, we were told repeatedly that there was going to be nuclear Armageddon. It came quite close to happening on more than one occasion, but most people didn't act like they were in imminent peril of annihilation. They got on with life. So I think Cassandras are always going to be getting airtime. There's definitely a market for predictions of doom in the US and indeed the European media. I've probably written a few of those articles myself in my young day. But I don't think that's the solution, because I think it's better to learn, I think, from the way the Taiwanese and South Koreans succeeded in the last year, that it's better to be generally paranoid than specifically prepared. And if you are sitting right next to China or North Korea, or if you're Israel, right next to some pretty hostile states in your neighborhood, the stance that you tend to adopt is one of general paranoia, because you don't really quite know how they're going to come at you, except that they're going to come at you. And that's why I think those countries performed relatively well last year and were quick to realize that there was a potentially very nasty pathogen on its way from China, while we dithered around and did nothing much really until mid-March. We had fantastic pandemic preparedness plans. I read some of them. One couldn't have read them all because there were just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. It's a remarkable how useless they were. And I think they're a perfect illustration of the perils of being very precisely and meticulously prepared for the wrong disaster. The UK public health authorities were also supposed to be well prepared. But I think when you look over the documents such as are available, the mistake they made was to be really well prepared for an influenza pandemic, not a coronavirus pandemic. So I'm kind of more and more persuaded of the benefits of general paranoia, because you're more flexible and you're ready for a wider range of scenarios. And you don't necessarily have a very detailed playbook. You just know that, as Larry Brilliant said long ago, I think it was way back in 2006, the key to success in a pandemic is early detection and early action. And that was a much better TED talk than Bill Gates's. But we definitely didn't heed his advice.
That's right. I remember that one. Yeah, Jared Diamond has this idea he calls constructive paranoia. And he tells a story of camping out with his hunter-gatherer buddies in Papua New Guinea when they're out birding and spending the night under these trees. And, he would pitch his tent and his friends would say, no, that's a dead tree. And he does the calculations. Well, it's only like 1 in 1,000 chances of this tree collapsing. And then he realizes, well, if I spend the night every night for 3 years, I'm dead. right? So just
Right.
constructively, you should just, kind of move in the direction of slight paranoia and just assume the worst here and, just take some safety measures. He also has, in the context of, because he's 80 something now, like the number one predictor of death is like falling in the shower. All right. So, that's the riskiest thing he's going to do during the day is take a shower. Okay. So you got to be a little paranoid about that. I was also thinking about the hindsight bias here with the Cassandras and the problem with, after the fact, you can see what we should have noticed. Like there's that famous Condoleezza Rice memo, August 9th, 2001, Osama bin Laden to, strike United States on United States soil. Bush should have seen it happen. And of course, in my other part of my day job is looking at conspiracies, 9/11 truthers point to that and they go, you see, he knew about it. There's that memo, from his own Secretary of State and so on. So he either let it happen on purpose or made it happen on purpose, lie hop and my hop. And in fact, the comparison I make is Roosevelt, supposedly knew about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor because look, here's all these pieces of intel. But when you look at the big picture, Roosevelt had like thousands of pieces of intel because they broke the magic code, broke the Japanese code, and so on. And same thing with Bush. He's just inundated with intel, which is the right one. Well, after the fact, you go back and go, there, that's the right memo. Yeah, well, how are you supposed to know that in advance?
Exactly.
That that's the one we should pay attention to. And I think that's always going to be a problem for the Cassandras working in government. They can issue all the memos they want, but which is the one we should pay attention to?
This is why doing old-fashioned history where you pore over the documents is very salutary, because, and that's part of what I do when I'm writing a book like Kissinger, as you reconstruct the decision-making process in the realm of national security, you realize that intelligence agencies are incentivized to cover their asses by making a lot of predictions of disaster. And in the same way, people in the national security bureaucracy are incentivized to present presidents with three options, two of which are non-viable, one of which they prefer. And so the understanding how these things work in practice very quickly leads you to realize the presidents are not omniscient, enlightened despots or unenlightened despots who make enormous numbers of decisions every day. On the contrary, they're often quite cut off from information flows by the sheer scale of those flows, and the information that reaches them comes through multiple filters. So conspiracy theorists are bad historians by and large. One of the reasons I wrote The Square and the Tower, the last book, was to show that many conspiracy theories are predicated on elaborate elite networks conniving at ulterior, dark, motivated outcomes. And if you actually go back and study the history of such networks, and I've worked on a number of them, including perhaps the one that's been most defamed in history, the German Jewish banking elite, you start to realize how limited the power is of such networks. Not that they have no power, but they simply don't have the power that's attributed to them by conspiracy theorists. This is why doing history is worthwhile in perhaps its old-fashioned form of plowing through the documents generated by governments as well as by corporations and realizing, apart from anything else, it'd be very, very hard to organize the kind of conspiracy that is constantly being suggested by people who don't really understand how things work.
Yeah, people on the outside always think the people on the inside have more power than they actually do. Yeah, in addition to, instead of lie hop, let it happen on purpose, and my hop, made it happen on purpose, I propose cow hop, capitalized on what happened on purpose. So, of course, Bush uses this, 9/11 as an excuse to invade Iraq. And Roosevelt was trying to, unite the American public and combat the American firsters so he could support Churchill and get America into the war, and he just couldn't do it. Well, Pearl Harbor did it. So he capitalized on what happened on purpose in that sense. I think a lot of that goes on in history.
I'm sure you're right. And one of the benefits of being a British historian is that we have a whole lot of past history of an overstretched superpower to draw on. Americans tend to want to learn from their own history exclusively, not realizing that very little that happened to the early republic is relevant to a superpower. But if you think about the United States as being essentially in the predicament of the British Empire in the first half of the 20th century, you see that's exactly how it works. First, you're dealing with far too many places in which things are going wrong in far too many different ways to have much more than a reactive response. And secondly, you do capitalize on disaster or opportunity when it presents itself, but it's very, very hard to do more than that. And premeditated plans to extend your world domination, those are hard to find in the archives.
Another explanation I offer for why people believe conspiracy theories as being true is that a lot of conspiracies really do happen. They are true. There are, rigged elections around the world, or, these shenanigans, Volkswagen, cheating the EU emission standards. That's a conspiracy. Watergate, Iran-Contra, WikiLeaks has revealed quite a bit, as did the Pentagon Papers, to what extent the Kennedy and Johnson administrations lied to the American public about the Vietnam War. So, and even one of my favorites, Operation Northwoods, that document given to Kennedy about how we can implement a false flag operation as an excuse to invade Cuba and assassinate Castro and so on. And some of them were just completely crazy, like an Alex Jones kind of thing, like, we'll shoot down an American airplane with students going to Cancun or something like that, and we'll blame it on the Russians. And to his credit, Kennedy said, we're not going to do any of this crazy stuff. But that his Joint Chiefs of Staff presented this as like a viable thing. So when Alex Jones says, false flag operation, that's not completely crazy, because some of that does go on.
I think one of the things that happened in the mid-20th century was that in World War II, which was a desperate struggle against formidable and ruthless enemies, the United Kingdom and the United States got very creative about the ways in which they played dirty tricks on the other side. And many of those people had careers after 1945 in the CIA and in its British equivalents, in which their wartime habits were rather hard to drop. In the same way that the same generation that had won World War II, in large measure by bombing Japanese and German cities, continued to believe that the way to win a war was to bomb. And that led to catastrophe in Vietnam, because of a fundamental failure to see that strategic bombing couldn't win that kind of a war against that kind of a country. So yeah, I mean, I don't think one should say dismissively that all conspiracy theories are wrong, because clearly a good deal of nefarious activity went on in the Cold War on both sides, and one should study it with one's eyes open. This is the challenge for me in writing Volume 2 of Kissinger. There's a huge array of conspiracy theories that relate to the Nixon administration and to Kissinger himself. There's a kind of tendency to write the history of that administration rather as if one were an advocate for the prosecution. But I want to remind readers that at the end of 1968, beginning of 1969, when that administration came into power, it was in a dire situation because of the mistakes of its predecessor, was apparently losing the war in Vietnam and indeed losing the Cold War, was at the beginning of a period of serious economic underperformance and inflation. They were dealt a very weak hand, and that therefore one has to understand the formulation of strategy in a hierarchical way. They had certain priorities, of which the first was to avoid Armageddon, to avoid World War III. The second was to get out of Vietnam. And everything beyond that, I think, was of lesser importance. Now, many people thinking and writing about history want to pass moral judgments on individual acts or particular parts of policy. But what you come to realize when you think about the national security strategy of any great power is that most of the choices are between evils, and the challenge is to try to pick the lesser evil, rather than there being a wonderfully good choice versus a bad and clearly wicked choice. It's only academics and journalists who've never made a tougher decision than to spike a piece or to veto a tenure case that think strategic decision making is easy and that the moral choices are obvious.
Christopher Hitchens was a friend, and I read most of his works, but the Kissinger book, just the premise of it, that he's a war criminal, given the context of the kinds of things that the United States was doing through the CIA, say, in South American countries to support fascist dictators over communist dictators because it's better, friendlier to American interests and so forth. I mean, it seems like war criminal is too harsh a charge. Maybe just kind of realpolitik decision making is just really hard to do, and in retrospect, it looks like you did the wrong thing or something like that. So, what are your thoughts on Kissinger and the role of American intelligence agencies in meddling around in other countries' elections and politics?
Well, Christopher Hitchens was a friend and somebody whose company I always enjoyed, but the Kissinger book was not his strongest effort. It's not at all well researched, apart from anything else. So it kind of falls down as history, and it suffers also from what I'll call historical grade inflation. Because if you start saying that he's a war criminal because he connived, let's say, at the support of under-democratic regimes, or was prepared to turn a blind eye to violations of human rights by allied governments and so on, then every Secretary of State really since World War II has to be classified as a war criminal. Did the Obama administration handle events in Egypt any differently from the way that the Nixon administration handled events in Chile? I can't really see any profound difference in what happened there. In fact, aid to Sisi's dictatorial regime continued even when it was obvious that significant human rights violations were going on. The Obama administration used drones with as much relish as the Nixon administration engaged in secret bombing. So I think the problem with the approach that says Kissinger's a war criminal is that therefore everybody in U.S. foreign policy, up to and including the most recent secretaries of state, is probably in the same category. And that's the same problem that you get to if you say that the Victorians committed genocide in India or perpetrated a Holocaust because famines occurred under British rule. You're rendering these categories useless by stretching their meaning too far. My own view is that one should not use the term Holocaust indiscriminately, and it's become a very unhealthy tendency in recent scholarship on European empires in the 18th and 19th century to essentially lump them together with the Nazis. But if Churchill is Hitler, then history starts becoming some kind of Alice in Wonderland realm in which nothing really has any meaning, and everything somehow is relativized to the point of absurdity. I think when you come to write the history of power, it's important to recognize that the choices one makes in the Situation Room are by their very nature the difficult ones, because the easy ones don't get passed all the way up to the White House. And the dilemmas that they faced in the 1970s are not fundamentally that different from the ones that the Biden administration faces today. It's confronted by a ruthless totalitarian antagonist that is using all kinds of methods to expand its power, as well as using ruthless force against its domestic enemies, that has tools at its disposal that the Soviets never had. I mean, think of the ongoing conflict in cyberspace that is being waged by the Chinese and their proxies, as well as their near allies, the Russians. It's a nasty world out there. And the US can't afford to say that it's only going to be best friends with squeaky clean democracies in such a world. So the first and obvious point is that the disaster of disasters would be a Chinese triumph, Chinese victory in Cold War II, because that would allow the totalitarian surveillance state to expand its surveillance beyond the borders of the People's Republic. And that would be a disastrous outcome, in my view. So the US needs to avert that, just in the same way that it needed to avert the Soviet triumph that might have made the post-war world a much worse place. We shouldn't delude ourselves about what will be necessary to win Cold War II. I believe we're in Cold War II, as I argue in the book. I think we have significant advantages. The crucial thing is we must not become our enemy in the course of waging this war. Now, this was a central and important insight of Cold War I that Orwell saw from the very beginning, from the very first article when he used the phrase Cold War, which was in 1945. Orwell predicted that all nuclear superpowers would end up as slave states. That's the central prediction that then informs 1984. Now, it was wrong. It was wrong. The United States was able, and its allies were able, to wage Cold War I without becoming totalitarians. There was much less convergence economically and politically than people expected as late as J.K. Galbraith in the 1960s. And that's the thing we need to remember, that if you are squaring up against a totalitarian enemy, the most important thing after winning is not becoming a version of that enemy. I do want to stress that the biggest disaster we face in the near term is actually totalitarianism. That's the biggest risk. Either that we lose to a totalitarian regime or we unwittingly drift into being one ourselves. And we could do that. We could do that because we've created the technological means for a surveillance state already in this country. It's just that the data are all currently in private hands. And we have an ideology which is rampant in academia today, which is functionally totalitarian, as well as a great many behaviors that recall totalitarian states, denunciations, struggle sessions, all the rest of it. So I think as I was concluding the book, it hit me. It was actually reading Nick Bostrom's paper on disastrous events that made me realize that Nick concludes in order to prevent disastrous technologies from running their disastrous course, we need to create a kind of world government with panopticon-like surveillance powers. And I thought as I was reading it, no, that's the very thing we must avoid, because that's the disaster itself right there. And that's a form of suicide for fear of death.
Why are we in a Cold War II with China? And to what extent is it similar to the first Cold War, where there's proxy wars, say, between North and South Korea, and we back one, China backs the other, I suppose? But what should I be worried about here in California? What do I care what the Chinese do to their people with their surveillance state? That's never going to happen here. We have the Constitution. And, we have trust busters that, if Google and Apple and Twitter get too big, well, the government will just break them up or something like that. I'm not worried about it. I think it was one of my favorite lines from Bob Wright's book, Non-Zero, is that one reason not to go to war with the Chinese is they make my minivan. Well, now they make my iPhone and my iPad and my computers. And,
right.
So what are we talking about here? What should I be worried about?
Well, I think part of the thing to worry about is that unlike in Cold War I, in Cold War II, it's really easy for the other side to penetrate our society, and they already have done to a very large extent. I mean, there were never, 400,000 Soviet students in US universities, and there were never the kind of economic ties that now exist between US and Chinese companies. So we are in a very different kind of Cold War, precisely because we're the open society, and they are able to take much greater advantage of that than the Soviets were. Remember, we always pretty much knew which Soviet citizens were here and which ones were spies. Well, good luck figuring that out with the very, very large Chinese population in the US today. Secondly, the Chinese economy is vastly larger than the Soviets ever was, and indeed may overtake the United States. I'm not certain it will, but it may in the next 10 years. So they have at their disposal much greater resources. Thirdly, Xi Jinping, since he came to power, has made it clear that he is intent on, at the very least, parity with the United States, and it becomes increasingly clear more than that. And a world in which China's the dominant power, that is to say, a one-party state that thinks nothing of herding minorities into labor and re-education camps, is not a world that I would look forward to. We take a lot for granted about American primacy that we would really miss if it went. I don't think you need to worry about a Chinese invasion of California anytime soon, not in the military sense. I do think we need to worry about a conflict in East Asia, potentially over Taiwan, that if it were to go wrong, would conceivably mark the end of US predominance. My nightmare scenario is, and I know I share this fear with Jim Stavridis, who's just published a novel about it, my colleague here at Hoover, Misha Oslin, and others. My worry is that we get into a showdown over Taiwan and lose. And that is a plausible scenario on the basis of recent wargaming, which would, I think, fundamentally end that period of American predominance that we have enjoyed throughout our lives. And it would be a very much altered world at that point in ways that ultimately would impact even Californian life. A final point. If there were such a conflict, it would certainly, I'm almost sure about this, lead to radical disruption of our internet-dependent society. I think that's where we now have a very real vulnerability. We're having this conversation via the internet. We've all grown very accustomed to working through the internet, but we know that cyber warfare has not really been taken to anything like its full potential yet. And all those people who worry about these things in the military know that the big problem in a full-blown conflict with China and presumably Russia, since they would likely line up together, would be the potentially real disruption that they could cause through cyber attacks. So yeah, I think there's lots to worry about in this scenario, and it's a much more near-term scenario than most people want to face.
So it's kind of a domino theory argument that if we let them have Taiwan, then what happens? How do you get to a disastrous scenario from there?
Well, Taiwan is pretty fundamental to Japan's security. If the United States was seen not to be able to maintain the status quo in East Asia, then certainly Japan would have to move swiftly to become a nuclear armed power. That, I think, would be one short-run consequence. The second problem would be that the United States is heavily reliant on international confidence for its current economic plans. The $6 trillion or so of spending that the Biden administration's announced this year, that's a pretty large chunk of US GDP, even though some of it's spread over several years, will be financed heavily by, as far as one can see, the Federal Reserve rather than taxpayers plus the bond market. A lot of this depends for its viability on the US dollar and the US 10-year Treasury remaining the dominant currency and risk-free security, respectively. If the lesson of British history has anything to offer, it is that when you lose your primacy geopolitically, the world no longer regards your currency and your debt in the same light. So I think there's a risk that if the US was seen to suffer a major reverse in East Asia, then investors would draw the conclusion that the game was up. And that would be a very expensive conclusion for a very over-leveraged system. And we are indebted in a way that we have never been. We are going to exceed the post-1945 debt-to-GDP ratio very shortly if we haven't already. So I think those are part of the cascade. I don't like the domino theory. I think one has to be aware of the domino theory because that was an erroneous view that if the US didn't fight to sustain South Vietnam, there would be a kind of collapse of democracy in Asia generally. And I think that turned out not to be true. In fact, the loss of South Vietnam turned out strategically not to matter a whole lot. But this is slightly different because I feel this is more like, America's Suez crisis, where you're suddenly seen to be no longer number one, and that has all kinds of cascading consequences, economic certainly, but consequences in the rest of the world. Because after all, if it were clear that the US could not uphold its commitments in East Asia, the same would presumably be true in Europe, and that would be an invitation to Vladimir Putin to exploit what would be a fundamental crisis of NATO. So my sense is that this would not be your 1950s or 1960s domino effect, but something more like what happened to the British Empire in the period of its dissolution, and that we would find ourselves looking back thinking gosh, we didn't realize how much Taiwan mattered. Just as people look back and realize that ultimately losing control of Egypt turned out to be extraordinarily important for not only Britain's power but the stability of the Middle East.
Unless it turns out Taiwan is like South Vietnam, and it didn't matter that much. Just so hard to know for predicting the future. I had John Mueller on a few weeks ago. His new book is The Stupidity of War. And he makes a similar argument you make about the First World War, that the UK should have just stayed out of it, and presumably the United States as well. And it would have just been a local European thing that would have just played itself out. And therefore no World War II, because no Hitler and no Treaty of Versailles and all that. And but on the other hand, I got him to concede that the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War II, these are good wars. We can't not intervene ever. So I guess the problem is when do you intervene? When do you act conciliatory and let the bad guy, let Putin have that part of Ukraine, but nothing more, maybe, versus actually doing something?
Well, I think one of the key arguments I tried to make in Doom is that the lesson for the United States of British history is that if you see a rival, a rising power that poses a threat directly to you or to your allies, you have to deter it. And if you fail to deter it, which Britain did twice with Germany, you will end up fighting an extraordinarily expensive conflict to reassert your primacy that will ultimately be unsustainable. And I worry that the US is stumbling into a similar set of mistakes to the ones made by Britain prior to 1914, in that we are talking the talk. Think of the things that Secretary of State Blinken has said recently, but it's far from clear that we really are able to deter China from seizing Taiwan. And yet, if they did it, we would find it very difficult to say, well, actually, Taiwan doesn't matter. And so the worst case scenario is that Taiwan is Belgium in 1914. You haven't convinced the Germans that you'll go to war over it, but when they violate its neutrality, you actually have to. And that's what I worry about in this American predicament, that we are talking very tough language to China these days, in some ways tougher than the Trump administration did. And yet it's not clear to me that we really have the capability to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and that if that were to happen next year, which I don't think is implausible, we would confront exactly the dilemma that British statesmen confronted in 1914, which is that we would actually need to go to war. Otherwise, the credibility of all our commitments would be at stake. So that's really the story I'm trying to tell. Doom befell the British Empire. It's gone. And what remains is not quite a little England, but it's certainly not a Great Britain. And doom is, in a geopolitical sense, is there for the United States. If you think of the US position today, in terms of its finances, in terms of its economic capability, in terms of what Paul Kennedy called imperial overstretch, it looks a lot like Britain in the mid-20th century. And it faces a formidable rival committed to a reordering of the geopolitical landscape. That's something that I tried to make clear in the last chapter. We struggle to see, because we don't pay much attention to what the Chinese say in Chinese. We listen to what they say to us in English, but we don't really pay attention to what they say to one another. We struggle to see how much more ambitious they have become since Xi Jinping became leader. And that's, I think, the kind of doom that we should focus on much more than we do.
Well, I know we're getting pressed up against your time limit with other engagements. Let me just go through the lightning round here and just get your thoughts on a few related subjects. How worried are you about the tech companies getting too big? Josh Hawley had a op-ed in, I think it was today or yesterday or Saturday's Wall Street Journal, saying we need to break up the tech companies. They're getting too powerful, which always amazes me when conservatives say we need a big government intervention into something. It's like, I thought you guys were in favor of small government and free market. Why isn't there a free market solution to the tech problem? Why doesn't someone, a billionaire, just start a competitor for YouTube or Twitter or whatever? So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I was worried about this problem back when I wrote The Square and the Tower, which is really, in many ways, a book about that. The argument I made there was that it was extremely dangerous for the public sphere to be dominated by a handful of companies that had achieved tremendous network superstar power. I don't think antitrust is the answer. I think that's a chimera. We'll waste a great deal of time on that. The answer is not trust busting. I mean, imagine trying to break up Google. You might be able to get Facebook to part with WhatsApp and Instagram, but I don't think you can solve the fundamental problem we face other than by rewriting or scrapping altogether Section 230, which I'm sure your listeners will be familiar with. But that's the sort of catch-22 of current legislation that allows the network platforms to censor as they please, but also to get away with it if they host harmful content. So you need to rewrite that so that political discrimination is no longer okay and they're much more liable for harmful content than they are. But you also need a First Amendment in cyberspace of some sort, because if the Supreme Court thinks this is the new public square, then it can't be the case that First Amendment rules don't apply. So I think there's a solution. It involves increasing their legal liability, because right now they have virtually none, thanks to the operation of Section 230. It's a lightning round, so I'll keep my answer short, but that's my solution. It's been my solution for the last 3 years, and I've yet to convince enough people.
Yeah, I'm always amazed when someone. Why isn't someone like a Peter Thiel just belly up to the bar and go, okay, here's the new Twitter, here's the new Instagram, here's the new, and he's got the money to do it. Now maybe he's just busy with other projects, maybe not him, but somebody like him, or Elon Musk. Forget Mars, let's solve the Twitter problem or whatever. Well, I guess Rumble is back online now.
Enormous. Look, once you've established a dominant position, it's a bit like Zipf's law is going to kick in, and the winner is going to take nearly all. And it's hard to displace Google in search. It's hard to displace Facebook in social networking. That's not going to fix this. But what is going to fix it, I think, is by making these companies far more accountable legally for the various harms that they're undoubtedly responsible for. And we need undoubtedly to change the legislative framework to make that possible. I know this is the right answer, by the way, Michael, because every time I write it, lawyers from these companies come and tell me what a terrible idea it is. And when I ask them why it's a terrible idea, they explain that it'll vastly increase the legal costs of those big tech companies. And I say, well, there you are. That's exactly what I'm trying to achieve.
Okay, post-Trump, what does it mean to be a conservative or a Republican now? And are you guys all divided between kind of populist conservatism and more traditional, so say George Will kind of conservatism?
Well, that's a tricky one. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a registered Republican. I'm not even a member of the British Conservative Party. I'm a kind of homeless classical liberal with romantic Jacobite tendencies. I don't feel at all at home in the Republican Party, never have done, doubt I ever will. And I never really felt at home with the Conservative Party when I lived in Britain. I've watched the embrace of populism by the Republican Party from the outset, expecting it to end badly. I think that was a recurrent theme of my journalism, that populism had a short half-life. And now I think they're in a very difficult position, because even the things that seem fundamental, they've thrown overboard, like fiscal responsibility. They inadvertently legitimized universal basic income and modern monetary theory last year. It doesn't leave them with much to argue against what Biden and his folks are doing. So it's a pretty big hole that they've dug themselves into. I think I was right to say that Trump would fade fast, and that ultimately he won't be much of a factor when we come around to the midterms and then to 2024. The key to the Republican revival is simply going to be the mistakes that the Democrats make. And they're already making them on immigration. They're making them by becoming woke on a whole range of issues that are, in fact, deeply unpopular. And I think if I'm right, and the problem of crime becomes a really significant one, rather than just a temporary one last year, they'll be in trouble on that issue too. So you won't have too much trouble reconstructing conservatism just in reaction against the overreach that we're going to see in the coming months and years.
I'm generally kind of fiscally conservative, so my liberal friends always tell me about modern monetary theory, almost like as long as the economy is growing, and then magic happens, and you can print all the money you want. And I'm trying to read up on this, and I don't know, it just feels like, and then a miracle happens. Like, wait a minute, how much can you print, and why? And since you've written about inflation, why will this not inevitably lead to inflation? What's the magic there?
Well, it is magical thinking. I began my career, as I said, writing about the German hyperinflation. It is deeply unhistorical to argue that the United States has this unlimited ability to finance its government through printing money. Stephanie Kelton's recent piece in the New York Times revealed that in truth, this way leads to a war economy with extensive controls to prevent inflation. At least she has the honesty to concede that. But I don't think you can do a war economy in peacetime. It won't have the legitimacy. You need a state of emergency to justify those controls. We no longer have a state of emergency, at least we shouldn't have. So I think this will all end in tears. I think the inflation risk is obvious. If Larry Summers, who spent the last 6 years warning about secular stagnation, thinks that they're overheating the economy, they're probably overheating the economy. So stand back and wait for the Fed to blink. If they don't, you're going to rerun the 60s when inflation went in two big jumps from below 2% to 3% to above 6%. And people forget the great inflation of the 1970s started in the later 1960s. Every time they say we're going to be as radical a government as the Lyndon Johnson government, I think to myself, be careful what you wish for. I mean, the Johnson administration had bold, ambitious domestic plans and achieved a great deal. But it ended in tears because of inflation and the lost war in Asia. So I don't know why anybody would want to invite comparison with LBJ, but that seems to be what they're doing.
Yeah, it's probably good to remember since we're living in a time where you can get a home mortgage for what, 3%, 2.5%, 4% at the most, maybe. In the 70s, it was like 15%, 16, 17%. And just imagine what those monthly mortgage payments would be. It's just a huge difference. And to what extent can the Fed control that? I mean, you see, Chairman Powell saying, well, we're going to hold interest rates down. Well, can you do that? I mean, can't they just go up? Can't inflation start? How do you think about that?
We will see the limits of the power of the central bank in the coming years, I think. But it's just a question of time before the whole story collapses, that inflation expectations are permanently anchored at these low levels. In truth, Tom Sargent explained all this many years ago with the concept of a regime change. And Sargent said, if you want to end inflation, there needs to be a radical change of fiscal and monetary policy that convinces people you mean it, which is essentially what happened under Paul Volcker. The corollary is that if you want to go back to inflation, you have a kind of imperceptible regime change where both monetary and fiscal credibility is lost. And I think, and he and I talked about this without ever doing it, a paper on the beginnings of inflation would reveal that exactly this process happens. It's what happened in the 60s. It'll happen now, that we will turn around and realize that actually, if you signal we've changed our monetary regime, we no longer have an inflation target, we have an average inflation target, and we're doing a paradigm shift in domestic policy that is going to increase the size of government by about 5% of GDP. If you tell people we're changing the regime, their inflation expectations are bound to adjust. They must do. So I think this is kind of something about which I have relatively high confidence, just as I have very high confidence that MMT is a fantasy.
Interesting. Okay. I own no cryptocurrency stocks. The riskiest I ever get in the stock market is I bought Amazon when the company was losing money. I bought Apple stock when, before the iPhone and so on. That's about the limits of my risk. Okay. But now my friends are, you got to get on the cryptocurrency, Shermer. This is the next big thing. This is the next Netflix, Amazon stock. It's going to be huge. And I don't know.
Well, I think you've already done all you need to do as an investor, frankly, Michael. You can retire happy because Amazon and Apple were two of the best bets you could have made in your lifetime. That's not to say there aren't other opportunities out there. I was a complete skeptic about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency 5 years ago, when my then teenage son was trying to convince me to get involved. By the time he was visiting me here in 2017, I realized he was right. And I've been much more actively engaged in the area of crypto, Bitcoin, and fintech since then. I think this is a pretty exciting frontier because in many ways, if I'm right about what we're doing to the existing financial system, i.e., we're straining the limits of the fiat monetary system, we're straining the limits of dollar dominance and the credibility of US fiscal policy, then it must logically make sense to look at alternative forms of money and quasi-money. It must make sense that our system of payments is deeply inefficient if we're still writing checks to one another that take days to clear, or if the remittances that my wife and I send to her relatives in East Africa are scalped by enormous commissions when the sums are still quite modest. I mean, all of this cries out for innovation, and the innovation's happening. The Ascent of Money, which has been my most successful book, essentially argued that financial innovation is very important as a basis for power. And financial innovation is one of the great forces of modern history, if not of all history. So I'm kind of long financial innovation, and that has proved to be a pretty good strategy, which I would recommend to anybody who wants to be as smart as you were when you bought Amazon and Apple at the dips.
Well, we'll see. As my dad always said, you don't actually make the money until you sell the stocks. So that's true.
Right, and then the government comes along and takes.
Yeah, I just did that this year. I sold a bunch because I wanted to shed some of it just because I had this long run of good luck. Maybe it'll be like Yahoo or IBM or something where it just kind of sputters out and dies. Okay, last point. Your book, Civilization, another one I really enjoyed. You talked about the West's 6 killer apps: competition, scientific method, rule of law, modern medicine, consumerism, and the work ethic. All right, since you wrote that book, here we are in 2021. Do we need any new killer apps, or any of those killer apps not as important anymore, or what are your thoughts on that?
I still think that was a pretty good list. Notable for certain omissions, I didn't include democracy because I think for the development of the West, the rule of law mattered a lot more. I wrote a follow-up book called The Great Degeneration, warning that some of our strengths were ebbing, and that if we weren't careful, we were going to undermine the killer applications with a variety, I think 4 major problems, one of which was the growth of the regulatory bureaucratic state, another of which was generational inequity in public finance, a third was the sort of decay of our educational system, and the fourth was the deterioration of the rule of law itself, the rule of lawyers taking over from the rule of law. I have to say, I think the Great Degeneration's warnings look pretty prescient today. We haven't really addressed meaningfully any of those problems, and most of them have got a lot worse. I mean, public finance is in far worse shape than I would have predicted when I wrote that book. The generational divisions are wider than when I wrote the book. The educational system of the United States is in an absolutely horrific state for reasons too numerous to go into. But the fact that the teachers' unions are more interested in California in renaming schools than actually teaching kids can maybe stand for a broader crisis. And I think the rule of law is in an unhealthy state too. It seems to me that those problems loom much larger than they did. Meanwhile, a lot of the things that made the West unique that I listed in Civilization are now generally available because it's kind of open source software. The only consolation I can maybe conclude with is that our principal antagonist, the People's Republic of China, cannot download all of the killer apps. They can never really have the rule of law, and they can never really have political competition. They can do all the other stuff, and they've done it with considerable success. In fact, their work ethic is certainly greater than ours now. Their consumer society is catching up. Modern medicine, I think they've performed well, though they did start a pandemic last year, let's not forget. But there can never be a full suite of killer applications as long as the Communist Party runs China. And that's the note of comfort I'll conclude on. Yeah, doom is something we think a lot about, but I don't think in reality that we are doomed. We still have a shot.
That's a good way to wrap it up. Do you think we could ever get to the point, maybe in centuries from now, where the city-state returns to prominence and the nation-state as a concept fades into kind of irrelevance?
Well, I think city-states always coexisted with empires. This was something that my old friend, the late Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm, argued in Nations and Nationalism. And so it seems to me it's not difficult to see the world as a world of empires and city-states. In some ways, it already is in Asia to an extent. There's Singapore as the city-state, there's the People's Republic of China as the empire. In truth, the nation-state's a sort of strange thing, as I try to argue in Doom. They come in such enormously different sizes that I'm not sure the category's a wholly meaningful one. And by chance, a few former empires are now billed as nation-states, like China or Russia. But in reality, they are empires that morphed into nation-states. And that means that they're far, far more powerful than most nation-states. Including would-be nation-states like my native Scotland. So yeah, I think that world of empires and city-states is imaginable, but I wouldn't want to bet my future on a city-state, because when push comes to shove, the empires can always shut those down. Ask the Hong Kongers.
Yeah, you know about the seasteading movement, right? Where we're going to start our own nation 100 miles out in the ocean. Like, yeah, as long as the nation-states don't come and invade, you'll be fine. All right. Final paragraph.
I think those libertarian.
Final paragraph of Doom, which I loved. History tells us to expect the great punctuation marks of disaster in no predictable order. The four horsemen of the Book of Revelation, conquest, war, famine, and the pale rider, death, gallop out at seemingly random intervals to remind us that no amount of technological innovation can make mankind invulnerable. Indeed, some innovations like those fleets of jet airplanes that transported so many infected people from Wuhan to the rest of the world in January of 2020 gave the horsemen the opportunity to ride in your slipstream. That's such a great sentence. Yet somehow the rider's arrival always takes us by surprise. For a moment, we contemplate the scenario of total extinction. We shelter in place, watching Contagion and reading Atwood. Perhaps the black swan becomes a dragon king and turns life upside down, but very rarely. Mostly for the lucky many, life after the disaster goes on, changed in a few ways, but on the whole, remarkably, reassuringly, boringly the same. With astonishing speed, we put our brush with mortality behind us and blithely carry on, forgetful of those who were not so lucky, regardless of the next disaster that lies in wait. Man, that's a great ending. What a great book. You're such a good writer. I love your writing, Niall. What's next on your plate for big projects?
Kissinger Volume 2
right.
is next and underway, and I fully intend to get that book written in the next couple of years. So back to the coalface of archival history and the day-to-day struggles in the corridors of power.
Immersed into the 1960s and 1970s with all that bad clothing. That's right.
Bad clothing, but a lot less political correctness.
Yeah, that's right. All right, Niall, thanks so much for coming on. Thanks for your latest book, and thanks for your work. It's important.
Thank you so much, Michael. I've really enjoyed our conversation.